the day J.P. Morgan was shot, and why nobody talks about it. On the morning of July 3, 1915, a heavy silence sat over the estate of one of the most powerful men in the world. Glen Cove, Long Island, was supposed to be quiet, a luxurious retreat of manicured gardens, ivy-covered stone walls, and servants who moved like shadows. The ocean breeze danced through the trees. A butler was polishing silver. Somewhere a maid changed fresh linens. And on the second floor, in a sprawling master suite covered in Persian rugs and dark mahogany paneling, J.P. Morgan Sr. rose from bed. He was 66 years old, wide in the belly, and fighting off the bronchial infections that came with age. But he was still, without question, the most feared name in finance. He had tamed Wall Street, saved the U.S. Treasury, merged steel empires with a phone call. When presidents needed money, they called Morgan. And when the Great War broke out in Europe, it was J.P. Morgan, not the White House, who quietly began financing Britain and France. By 1915, he controlled more than $500 million in wartime loans and munitions deals, money that would later become the reason America entered the war. Some cheered his influence. Others called it treasonous. But Morgan didn't care what they called it. He was building the next century. And then someone rang the doorbell. Morgan walked barefoot across the marble foyer. He wore a silk dressing robe, unbothered by the early hour. Outside stood a well-dressed man in a suit and straw hat, holding a newspaper under his arm. He said his name was Frank Holt and that he was a professor, an academic. He needed just 5 minutes of Morgan's time to talk about the war. Morgan narrowed his eyes. He didn't like strangers, but he hated appearing afraid even more. So he opened the door, and then all hell broke loose. Holt didn't hesitate. He pulled a .32 caliber revolver from beneath his coat and fired. The first shot hit Morgan in the upper thigh, shattering muscle. The second grazed his abdomen. Morgan screamed, not in fear but rage, and stumbled back, clutching the doorframe. Blood dripped down his robe. Holt stepped forward, ready to finish the job. But J.P. Morgan didn't fall. He roared. It wasn't a groan or a gasp. It was a full-throated bellow, the kind that came from a man used to giving orders, not dying in hallways. He launched himself forward, grabbing Holt by the coat and slamming him into the wall. The two men struggled. Morgan's blood smeared across the polished floors. Holt tried to raise the gun again, but a second figure charged from the hallway. It was Morgan's butler. The two men tackled Holt, pried the revolver from his hand, and wrestled him to the ground. Within minutes, Morgan's security and servants pinned him down, hands behind his back, gun kicked across the floor. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the blood and screams and violence, J.P. Morgan never passed out. He simply looked at his attacker and said, "Who the hell are you?" The answer wouldn't just shock the Morgan family. It would shake Washington, because Holt wasn't who he claimed to be. And Morgan wasn't his first target. The story the newspapers printed was neat, clean, a madman with radical ideas. Another symptom of war hysteria. But it was a lie, crafted to hide the truth, that a man had bombed the U.S. Capitol and then tried to assassinate the country's most powerful financier, and he almost got away with it. After Holt was taken into custody, local police were baffled. They found the revolver, a blood-stained hat, and a torn-up note in his pocket. On it were scrawled phrases about violence, awakening the people, and a message to arms dealers. But it wasn't until the FBI began searching his boarding house in Manhattan that the full picture started to form. Inside his room, investigators found explosives, handwritten blueprints, letters addressed to government officials, and then came the real horror. A diary. In it, Holt had written about planting a bomb inside the U.S. Capitol building just 48 hours before he tried to shoot Morgan. The bomb had been real. It exploded around midnight on July 2, 1915, inside the Senate reception room. The walls cracked, tiles shattered, smoke filled the chamber. But since it was late and Congress was out of session, no one was killed. At the time, authorities had chalked it up to a prank or a misfire. There were no suspects, no leads. Now they had one. And as the evidence piled up, it became clear. Frank Holt was a fake name. The man in custody was actually Eric Muenter, a disgraced former Harvard professor who had faked his death in 1906 after poisoning his pregnant wife with arsenic. He had disappeared for 9 years, changed his identity, taught at colleges under false credentials, and slowly, quietly, built a new life with one goal: to stop J.P. Morgan from funding a war that Muenter believed was corrupting the soul of humanity. And now the world knew. A former professor turned fugitive who bombed the Capitol, shot one of the most powerful men in the world, and had the fingerprints of revolution in his pocket. But the part they don't tell you? The part buried in dusty police reports and redacted telegrams? Is what happened next. Because Eric Muenter never stood trial. Just days after his arrest, he was found dead in his jail cell, allegedly having hanged himself with his own belt. No guards saw it, no note was left, no investigation followed. His body was cremated, the case was closed, and the story, almost instantly, was forgotten. As if history itself was embarrassed. As if someone wanted it that way. Long before the headlines screamed, "Morgan shot," before the bomb in the Capitol and the revolver at Glen Cove, the man America would know as Frank Holt was just another name on a university roster. Only he wasn't really Holt. And he wasn't just another academic. His real name was Eric Muenter, and his story begins in Germany. Born in the 1870s and raised in Texas after immigrating to the U.S., Muenter had the sharp mind of a scholar but the eyes of someone who lived somewhere else entirely, inside his own head. He earned degrees at the University of Chicago and Harvard, excelling in languages and philosophy. Students admired his intellect. Colleagues called him intense, too intense. There was something in his presence that always felt unfinished, like a man rehearsing a role rather than living one. By 1904, he was married, teaching German at Harvard, and raising a young family. But things weren't right at home. His wife, Leone Krems, had just given birth to their second child, and had become mysteriously ill. Friends noted how Muenter grew colder, more distant. He began making cryptic statements about purification, rebirth, and the corruption of the soul. Then, one night in 1906, Leone collapsed in agony and died. The official cause? Acute gastroenteritis. But the symptoms didn't add up. Neither did the timeline, or the bottle of arsenic-laced tonic discovered in the kitchen cupboard. When investigators started asking questions, Muenter vanished like smoke, no warning, no trace, not even a funeral for his wife. It wasn't until months later that newspapers caught up with the rumor. Eric Muenter had poisoned his wife and fled Harvard. They issued a warrant for his arrest, but he was gone. Some said he drowned himself. Others said he ran to Europe. No one had a photo. No one could prove anything. Case closed. But it wasn't, because Eric Muenter wasn't dead. He just changed his name. Under the alias Frank Holt, Muenter began a second life, teaching at obscure colleges, moving from one state to the next, always a step ahead of suspicion. In Texas, he was a linguistics professor. In New York, he wrote op-eds about morality and war. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, quoted Plato, preached nonviolence. All the while, he was collecting dynamite, sketching bomb casings, writing letters to senators, watching headlines, and no one knew who he really was. What does it take for a man to slip between identities so easily? To abandon his name, his children, his past? For Muenter, it was righteous conviction. He believed America was being hijacked by corporations, banks, and warmongers like J.P. Morgan. He saw World War I not as a foreign tragedy, but as an industrial horror being fueled by American businessmen under the guise of neutrality. Morgan, in his mind, was the puppet master, the man who made murder profitable, and so Muenter, reborn as Holt, decided to make him the symbol. If Morgan could bankroll death, he would wear it. Muenter's transformation wasn't just physical, it was ideological. In his letters and diary entries, he wrote about the cleansing nature of violence. He believed a single act, if large enough, could shake the world awake. And so, in July 1915, he made his move. First, the bomb in the Capitol, to send a message to Congress. Then the attempt on Morgan's life, to send a message to power. But Muenter didn't just want to kill a man. He wanted to change time, stop the war, break the machine. He was delusional, yes, but his actions were precise, calculated, and deeply rehearsed. He kept travel logs, timetables, train tickets. He even sent letters to newspapers explaining his motives, letters that didn't arrive until after he was already in jail. And that's where his story should have ended. Behind bars, on trial, the man who attacked J.P. Morgan and bombed the Capitol should have been infamous. His name should have lived on beside anarchists and assassins. History should have studied him. But that's not what happened. Instead, just days after his arrest, Muenter was found dead, hanging in his jail cell. The guards said it was suicide. No note, no witnesses, and the records sealed, Uncle Luke tells. Now pause right here, because this is the moment when history gets suspicious. This man bombed the Capitol, shot J.P. Morgan, faked his own death once already. And days before he was scheduled to face federal interrogation, he's found hanged with his own belt, a belt they shouldn't have let him keep? Come on now! I'm not saying it was a setup. But you should definitely like, comment, and subscribe, because stories like these, they disappear for a reason, and Uncle Luke ain't letting that happen again. Now, back to the ghost. The public didn't ask questions. The media painted Muenter as a lunatic and moved on. Morgan recovered. His wounds became legend. And the government quietly scrubbed the entire ordeal from its memory. Even today, most American history books don't mention Eric Muenter. You won't find his name next to Lee Harvey Oswald or John Wilkes Booth or Timothy McVeigh. Why? Because Muenter didn't serve a political agenda. He wasn't left or right. He wasn't part of a movement. He was something more dangerous. A man with nothing to lose and no party to blame. A man who crossed oceans and time zones to punish power for turning war into a business. And that scared people. Because if someone like him could walk through the front door of J.P. Morgan's mansion, what door couldn't he walk through next? The newspapers barely caught their breath. Within hours of the attack on J.P. Morgan, headlines screamed with half-truths and garbled timelines. Wall Street Titan wounded by madman. Bombing linked to shooting. Well-known banker survives assassination attempt. The story should have gripped the country. It should have rattled boardrooms and bled across front pages for weeks. But by Monday, it was already old news, because someone made it disappear. Inside the Morgan household, the scene was chaos. Blood still stained the marble floor. The revolver lay bagged in a police locker. But Morgan, limping, bruised, stitched across the thigh, was already back in meetings. Already on the phone with Europe. He refused to be seen as vulnerable. He wouldn't let a lunatic's bullet tarnish the myth he'd spent decades building. Not in wartime. Not when the real war, the war of influence, was just beginning. What no one reported was what happened that night, after the police left, after Holt or Muenter or whoever he was had been dragged away. Morgan didn't rest. He ordered a private security firm to conduct its own investigation, quietly, off the books. Within 24 hours, they were burning documents, sealing records, calling in favors. Anyone who had seen Holt in the weeks before the attack was paid off or warned, and Morgan's lawyers were already in contact with Washington, pressuring them to treat the case not as a matter of national terrorism, but personal assault. Because there was more at stake than Morgan's pride. There were ledgers, ledgers that proved just how deeply entangled Morgan's firm was in arms deals with Britain and France, records showing loans, shipments, shadow partners, and Holt had written about it, in letters, in diary entries, in statements that could have turned the public against him, the war, and the banks profiting from it. Morgan needed it buried. So it was. The federal case against Muenter quietly narrowed. No grand jury, no lengthy trial, no public interrogation of why a man who bombed the U.S. Capitol and nearly killed the richest American was allowed to keep his belt in a jail cell. Because if people started asking questions, they might not stop. The financial markets, oddly, didn't crash. They wobbled, sure. Jitters in steel, a hiccup in railroads. But the Morgan name was too big to fall, too central to fail. Instead, the event was spun as proof of Morgan's resilience. Editorials praised his bravery. Stockholders doubled down. War contracts flowed in, uninterrupted. And Morgan, stitched and bruised, was seen walking Wall Street by the end of the week. It was performance, theater, control. But behind the curtain, something had shifted. Other bankers grew anxious. If Morgan could be targeted in his own mansion. What did that mean for the rest of them? Some hired private guards. Others moved their families out of Manhattan. Panic didn't ripple through the public. It rippled through the elite. They weren't untouchable anymore. And for a brief, terrifying moment, they knew it. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Wilson was livid, not because of the attack, but because of the optics. The Capitol bomb, followed by an attempted assassination of the nation's top financier, made the U.S. look weak, vulnerable, unprepared. Congress launched a closed-door review of Capitol security. The Bureau of Investigation, years away from becoming the FBI, was ordered to locate anyone associated with Muenter. But they found nothing. Muenter had worked alone. No cell, no manifesto. Just one man with two names and a quiet fury. Still, that didn't stop them from rounding up radicals, anarchists, socialists, German immigrants, anyone whose politics didn't align with the status quo. In less than a month, 5 professors were fired for unpatriotic behavior. Dozens of newspapers were raided. It was a prelude to something darker, the surveillance state that would grow in the decades to come. Muenter may have died, but his shadow kept moving. Then there was the Morgan family. To the public, they played their roles, stoic, brave, patriotic, but inside, the bullet holes hadn't healed. Jack Morgan, JP's son and heir, was furious, not just at the attacker but at his father, at the system that demanded silence, at the machine they were all complicit in. He had grown up in privilege, yes, but that morning on Long Island, he had watched death walk through the front door. He had seen the myth bleed, and that changed everything. Jack began to distance himself, quietly, politically. Where his father saw war as opportunity, Jack began advocating for post-war rebuilding. He would go on to support causes his father had ignored: international diplomacy, cultural institutions, even peace talks. He wasn't a saint. He still ran banks. But something had shifted. Sometimes legacies crack without breaking. Sometimes a bullet rewrites a family. But the most tragic fallout? It came from the silence. From the erasure. Because Muenter's story didn't just vanish. It was deleted. History forgot him. Textbooks ignored him. The Capitol bombing became a footnote, the attempted assassination, a curiosity for true crime buffs. And what should have been a national reckoning, a moment of reflection on war, wealth, and power, became nothing more than a one-day headline. That is the real fallout. Not the blood, not the bomb, but the silence that followed. Because silence, when bought by power, is louder than truth. And now, over a century later, most Americans still don't know that J.P. Morgan was ever shot. They don't know that a bomb tore through the Capitol just days before. They don't know that the man behind it all once taught at Harvard, once faked his death, once poisoned his wife and walked away a free man. And maybe they don't want to know. Because knowing makes you ask questions. And asking questions, that's dangerous. History doesn't forget by accident. It forgets because someone told it to. The day after J.P. Morgan was nearly assassinated, editors at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Chicago Tribune received personal letters, not from police, not from the president, but from Morgan's own legal team. Written in the firm's signature parchment, with gold-pressed seals, the message was simple. This story will do more harm than good. Consider the nation's interest. Consider your shareholders. They didn't need to be told twice. By the next morning, the shooting was already relegated to the second page, then the third, then gone entirely. As if America's most powerful banker hadn't just been shot in his home. As if the man behind it hadn't bombed the U.S. Capitol just days before. As if none of it had ever happened. But it did happen. And someone made sure you'd never hear about it. To understand the silence, you have to understand the control. J.P. Morgan didn't just run banks. He ran information. At the time of the attack, Morgan's financial empire had ties to over 25 newspapers across the country. Direct ownership, loan arrangements, and strategic partnerships, all euphemisms for leverage. One wrong headline, and he could pull their funding, one editor out of line, and their entire publication could be buried in lawsuits, audits, or worse, silence. So they listened, because everyone owed Morgan something. And the silence began to spread. Even the U.S. government joined in. When internal memos from the Department of Justice were leaked a decade later, they revealed that top officials were ordered to limit visibility of the Morgan shooting, not for national security reasons, but to preserve market confidence. Translated? Protect the rich. Quiet the truth. They scrubbed the shooter's name from official archives, sealed his psychiatric evaluations, buried the results of the internal Capitol bombing investigation, and then launched a new distraction, a press campaign about patriotic unity and supporting American industry. Morgan, of course, was at the center of those ads. He was now a hero, a survivor, a symbol of American strength. And the bullet holes, forgotten. But not everyone forgot. There were whispers in university halls, fringe journalists who kept digging, a librarian in Kansas who discovered a missing court document and tried to publish a paper. She was fired. A young teacher in Ohio who included the event in his syllabus. He was accused of pushing anarchist conspiracies. Even Morgan's own employees were warned, never speak about the morning Holt, or rather, Eric Muenter, walked through the front door with a loaded gun. One secretary, who had helped clean the bloodstains from the carpet, told her granddaughter the story 60 years later. It was like it never happened, she said, like we were all hypnotized into forgetting. That's not an accident, that's power. You see, there's a kind of silence more dangerous than noise. Not the silence of a secret kept, but the silence of a story erased. The media didn't misreport it. They untold it, line by line, memory by memory, like it was never there. Why? Because the attack revealed too much. It revealed that even the most powerful man in America, arguably the world, could bleed. It revealed that resentment toward Wall Street wasn't just political, it was personal. And if Holt had been a little closer, a little faster, J.P. Morgan's empire might have collapsed. The war effort might have stalled. The stock market might have panicked. And people might have started asking questions about who really runs the country. That's the story they couldn't afford to tell. So instead, they told a different one. That Holt was a lone madman, not a symbol of public unrest. That Morgan was untouched, unshaken, unaffected. That America was safe, controlled, and immune to revolution. And we believed it. For a while. But here's the truth they couldn't bury forever. Eric Muenter wasn't insane in the way they claimed. He wasn't hallucinating or incoherent. He was methodical, brilliant, calculated. A man with two identities, two lives, and one mission: to stop America from becoming the war machine he believed it was turning into. Was he justified? Absolutely not. But was he warning us? Maybe. Because his letters recovered years later read less like madness and more like prophecy. He wrote of a future where banks would fund both sides of wars, where the rich would profit from blood, where violence would be sanitized, headlines managed, truth owned, a world like ours. And Morgan? He lived, continued to amass power, died peacefully in 1913 in Rome, surrounded by luxury. The shooting was never mentioned in his obituary. No mention of the bullet that grazed his leg. Eric Muenter died in a prison cell. That's what the records say. They tell us he leapt to his death inside the Tombs, Manhattan's infamous detention complex, by diving headfirst from the bars of his cell onto the concrete floor. No note, no scream, just silence. But there's a problem with that story. Actually, there are several. For one, the autopsy report doesn't match the initial police narrative. Muenter's skull was indeed fractured, but so was his jaw and his wrists, and there were ligature marks around his neck, as if someone had tried to strangle him before the fall. Guards claimed it was thrashing, a final fit of madness, but the medical examiner never used that word, and he never released the full report. It was sealed, on direct order from a federal official, one of Morgan's own legal advisors. Then there was the missing diary. Muenter had kept one, a small black-bound journal filled with codes, references to shipments, letters never sent. It vanished the day after his death. The guard who found the body was reassigned. The warden refused to comment, and the man who had once shaken the financial core of the world was suddenly, conveniently, gone. No trial, no final words. Just a name scratched off a list. That's not justice. That's a cover-up. But why would they go so far? Why kill a man who was already behind bars? Because Eric Muenter knew too much. He knew where the weapons were going, which banks were funding the British war machine, which neutral American companies were shipping munitions through Canada. He'd intercepted letters, bought train manifests under a fake name, photographed transactions in Lower Manhattan. He hadn't just acted out of rage, he had proof. And had he made it to trial, it would have all come out. The names, the banks, the ships, and maybe, just maybe, the myth of American innocence in World War I would have shattered before it ever took hold. They couldn't let that happen. So they made sure his voice went silent. Forever. But here's the truth. Eric Muenter wasn't a villain in the traditional sense, nor was he a hero. He was a man who crossed lines, made choices born out of fury and loss, and believed, fatally, that violence could stop violence. He poisoned his wife. He bombed the Capitol. He tried to assassinate J.P. Morgan. There's no excuse for any of that. But there is a reason. A man doesn't wake up one day and become a ghost unless the world refuses to listen. He believed America had been sold. That patriotism had become profit. That the same man sending your son to war was pocketing the returns on steel and explosives. He wasn't wrong. He was just the wrong person to say it, because when the wrong person tells the truth, we call it insanity. And when the right person lies, we call it leadership. Eric Muenter's actions were reprehensible, but his warnings weren't imaginary. In the decades that followed, everything he predicted happened. Wars became markets, banks became weapons. Truth became a product you could buy, sell, or delete, and the man who saw it coming, forgotten. Until now. Because buried beneath the rubble of history is a truth that still flickers, a question no one asked. What if Muenter hadn't died that night? What if he had stood trial? What if the American public, in the heat of 1915, had seen the receipts, read the telegrams, heard the names? Would we have entered the war? Would the Morgan Empire have fractured? Would we have questioned the price of patriotism before it was too late? We'll never know, because the man who tried to warn us was erased, but not completely. Because every few decades, someone finds the story again. A loose file, a forgotten news clipping, a cracked photograph in a family archive. And every time, the pattern repeats. Confusion, shock, denial. How could we forget this? Why weren't we told? And then the realization, we were told. We just weren't allowed to remember. That's why this story matters. Not to vindicate a murderer. Not to romanticize a man who brought fear and chaos to innocent people. But to confront a system that selects which stories get remembered and which get deleted. Eric Muenter's tale is not a celebration. It's a warning that truth doesn't always survive history. That memory is a battlefield, and that the stories we don't hear might be the ones that change everything. So the next time someone tells you history is written by the victors, remember this. Sometimes it's written by the silencers, by the editors who cut the line, by the officials who seal the file, by the families who don't want the stain on their legacy. The day J.P. Morgan was shot should have been the story of the century, but it was buried. And the man who pulled the trigger? His name was Eric Muenter. He was real, he was dangerous, and he saw something the rest of the world refused to look at. That's why they made us forget him. But now, you remember. And maybe that's enough to start asking what else has been erased. If this story made you question what you know, if it cracked open something deeper, if it made history feel alive again, then you're exactly the kind of person who belongs here. This is Uncle Luke Tells. And if you want more stories they tried to bury, you know what to do. No note about the man who tried to kill him in front of his wife and son. Just legacy, accomplishment, and silence. That's how history forgets. Not with time, but with intention. And now that you know, the question is, what else have they erased?